The Colorado Rockies, 1888. They say the mountains have no memory, that they are impartial witnesses to triumph and to tragedy. They swallow secrets whole, burying them under silent blankets of snow. For Mabel Blackwood, they were meant to be a grave. Her husband, the man who swore to protect her, led her into the frozen heart of the wasteland, and with a kiss as cold as the ice forming on her lashes, he left her to die. But the mountains had a secret of their own. For when all hope was lost and the world had turned its back, a lone wolf would become her guide, leading her to the only man who could understand her quest for revenge, a man whose own ghosts were howling for a reckoning. The cold was a physical thing, a malevolent presence that seeped through the thick wool of Mabel Blackwood's coat and settled deep into her bones. It was a cold that felt personal. For 3 days the blizzard had raged a churning vortex of white that had erased the world, leaving only the cramped, shivering interior of their sheltered wagon. "Just a little longer, my love." Silas had said, his voice a low, reassuring murmur that had once been the source of all her comfort. He brushed a stray strand of blonde hair from her face, his fingers surprisingly warm against her chilled skin. "The storm has to break eventually. Then we'll be on our way to Silver Creek. A new life, Mabel. Everything I promised." Mabel nodded, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her chapped lips. She was a St. Louis girl, the daughter of a successful merchant, Thaddeus Kane. Her world had been one of brick-paved streets, gas lamps casting a golden glow on rainy evenings, and the gentle hum of civilized society. Silas Blackwood, with his raven hair eyes the color of a summer sky. And talk of silver fortunes waiting in the untamed West had been a whirlwind romance. He was charming, ambitious, and utterly captivating. Her father had been skeptical, warning of the fickle nature of prospectors and the brutal realities of frontier life. But Mabel, swept up in the grand adventure of it all, had seen only the promise in Silas's eyes. Her dowry, a substantial sum that made her father wince, was their ticket to this new life. Now that life felt very far away, their party consisted of 4, herself and Silas, and 2 hired hands, a grizzled, quiet man named Elias, and a younger, jumpy fellow called Bartholomew. And then there was Maeve. Maeve was the antithesis of Mabel. Where Mabel was fair and refined, Maeve was dark and sharp-edged. Her hair was the color of jet, her eyes a knowing, challenging brown. She had joined their party in Denver, introduced by Silas as an expedient guide, someone who knew the treacherous mountain passes. She had the hardened look of a saloon girl, a survivor who had seen the worst of men and given as good as she got. An unspoken tension had existed between the 2 women from the start. Mabel felt Maeve's gaze on her often, a look that was not quite pity, not quite contempt, but a disconcerting mixture of both. On the 4th day, the blizzard broke. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the pines. The world outside was a masterpiece of blinding white and brilliant blue. Silas declared it was time to move on. The pass, he insisted, was just ahead. The trail was treacherous, a narrow shelf carved into the mountainside. To their left, the mountains soared into the sky. To their right, a chasm fell away into a sea of frosted pines. Elias, the older hand, seemed uneasy. "The snow's fresh, Mr. Blackwood," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "Unstable. Might be best to wait another day, let it settle." Silas had clapped him on the shoulder, his smile broad and confident. "Nonsense, Elias. Fortune favors the bold. We've lost enough time as it is. Silver Creek awaits. Mabel, seated in the wagon, clutched the wooden siding as the wheels groaned and slipped. She trusted Silas. She had to. Her entire world was built on that trust. She glanced at Maeve, who rode a short distance ahead. The other woman's face was a stony mask, her eyes fixed on the trail. The accident happened with a horrifying suddenness. A loud crack like the snap of a giant bone echoed through the pass. The ground beneath the outer wheels of the wagon simply gave way. Mabel felt a sickening lurch, a moment of weightlessness, before the wagon tilted violently. She was thrown against the canvas cover, her head striking a wooden support with a sickening thud. Boxes of supplies, cookware, and personal belongings crashed around her. Her leg was pinned, a searing white-hot pain shooting up from her ankle. The world was a dizzying blur of snow ski and the splintering wood of the wagon as it slid not into the main chasm, but down a steep rock-strewn ravine, coming to a jarring halt against a stand of hardy aspens, some 50 feet below the trail. Silence. Then the frantic sound of Silas's voice from above. "Mabel, Mabel, my God! Can you hear me? I'm here!" She cried out, her voice thin and reedy. "My leg. I think it's broken." She could hear panicked voices from the trail above. Bartholomew was near hysterics. Elias was trying to calm him. After what felt like an eternity, Silas's face appeared at the ripped opening of the canvas. His expression was a mask of anguish. "Don't you worry, my love," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll get you out of there. Just hold on." He disappeared again. The minutes stretched into an hour. The initial shock began to wear off, replaced by the relentless throbbing agony in her leg. Finally, Silas returned, his face grim. "The wagon is too unstable," he announced, his voice carrying down the ravine. "We can't risk coming down there. It could go the rest of the way at any moment. And your leg? Moving you could be dangerous." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Mabel's pain. "What are we going to do?" "I'm going for help," he said, his voice firm, decisive. "Silver Creek can't be more than a day's ride, maybe less. I'll ride as fast as I can and be back with a doctor and a proper rescue party before you know it. Elias and Bartholomew will stay here, keep watch." He was leaving her. The thought was a fresh wave of terror. "Silas, no, please don't leave me." "It's the only way, Mabel," he insisted. His face softened. "I'll leave you with blankets, food, and a pistol. You're a strong woman. You can hold on for a day. I promise you I will be back. I swear it on my love for you." From her wrecked vantage point, she saw Maeve pass a small bundle down to him. Food and a blanket. He carefully lowered it down to the wagon on a rope. "I love you," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast, cold emptiness. "I love you too," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. She watched as he and Maeve mounted their horses. Then a strange thing happened. Bartholomew, the jumpy hand, seemed to protest. His voice was high and agitated. Silas spoke to him, his tone low and sharp. Then, with a swift, brutal movement, Silas struck the younger man, sending him tumbling into the snow. Elias moved to intervene, and Silas drew his pistol. The message was clear. Silas and Maeve turned their horses and rode away. Not in the direction of Silver Creek, but back the way they had come. They didn't look back. A new, more terrible cold began to creep into Mabel's heart. Down in the wreckage, she was trapped injured and alone with 2 men on the ridge above who had just witnessed their employer's cold brutality. The promised swift return already felt like a lie. The sun began to dip below the peaks, painting the snow in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it was a cruel mockery. As the shadows lengthened, the temperature plummeted. Elias, the older hand, eventually made his way cautiously down the slope. His face was etched with a grim pity. He didn't speak at first, just examined the wreckage and her trapped leg. "Ankle's busted for sure, Mom," he said finally. "Maybe worse." "He's coming back, isn't he?" Mabel asked, her voice trembling. "Mr. Blackwood, he's coming back for me." Elias met her gaze, and in his weary eyes she saw the devastating truth. He didn't need to say the words. "He ain't coming back, Mom," he said softly, his voice full of a sorrow that was not just for her, but for the harshness of the world he knew so well. "He and that woman, they took the pack mule with the rest of the supplies, left us with next to nothing." He gestured up to the ridge where a dazed Bartholomew was now sitting. "He paid us for the trip and a little extra for our silence, told us to ride south after a day, said anyone who found you would just assume it was a tragic accident. The whole party perished." The words hit Mabel with the force of a physical blow. Betrayal. It was a word she had only read in books. She had never understood its true meaning until this moment. It was not just the act itself, but the chilling premeditation, the concerned looks, the loving words, the final false promise. All of it had been a lie, a carefully constructed performance leading to this single brutal conclusion. He had left her to die. He had taken her father's money, the foundation of their supposed future, and he had left her to freeze or starve in a broken wagon in the middle of a God-forsaken wilderness. The pain in her leg was a distant thrum compared to the cataclysmic agony that ripped through her soul. Elias did what he could. He managed to free her leg, the pain causing her to black out for a moment. He splintered it with broken pieces of the wagon frame and strips of canvas. He built a small, smoky fire just outside the wreckage and gave her a thin, greasy broth from a rabbit he managed to snare. "We can't stay here, Mom," he said, as darkness fell completely, bringing with it a cold that was a living, breathing predator. "We'll rest tonight. At dawn, Bartholomew and I. We have to go. We ain't equipped to survive out here for long, and we surely can't carry you." He didn't have to say the rest. She was a liability. A death sentence. "Where did he go?" Mabel asked, her voice a dead monotone. "Blackwood. Where did he really go?" Elias looked at the fire. "Heard them talking a few nights back. Weren't heading for Silver Creek. They were circling back, aiming for a town called Redemption, down in the Southern Territory. Said he had business there. A saloon, a mining claim he'd already bought. With her money. It all clicked into place. The entire journey had been a ruse. He had never intended to start a new life with her. He had only needed to get her far enough into the wilderness that her disappearance would be absolute. That night, as the stars blazed with a fierce, indifferent light in the ink-black sky, Mabel did not weep. The tears were frozen inside her, transformed into shards of ice. The naive St. Louis girl who had dreamed of adventure was gone, perished in the wreckage of the wagon. In her place, something new was beginning to form. Something hard and cold and unyielding. Before the first hint of dawn, Elias and Bartholomew came to her. They left her the remaining food, a pittance of hardtack and dried meat, the pistol and one of their blankets. "God be with you, ma'am," Elias said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite suppress. He couldn't meet her eyes. She watched them climb the ravine and disappear over the ridge, and then she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence of the mountains descended vast and complete. It was the silence of a tomb. But as the first rays of sun touched the highest peaks, a new sound reached her, a long, mournful howl that seemed to rise from the very soul of the wilderness. It was the cry of a lone wolf. The first day of solitude was a blur of pain and disbelief. Mabel lay in the mangled wagon, the rough wool of the blanket scratching her chin, and stared at the ripped canvas ceiling. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps, every snap of a frozen branch like the cocking of a hammer. She was suspended in a state of shock, her mind replaying Silas's betrayal on a torturous loop. His smile, his touch, his promises, all poisoned, now grotesque parodies of the love she had believed in. By the second day, the gnawing reality of her situation set in. The small pile of food Elias had left was pitifully small. The cold was a constant, insidious enemy, and the throbbing in her leg was a fiery anchor chaining her to this metal and wood coffin. Despair was a heavy shroud threatening to suffocate her. It would be so easy to simply close her eyes to let the cold take her to drift away from the agony of her body and her heart. But then she would see his face. Silas. Not the charming suitor, but the cold-eyed executioner on the ridge. And a different kind of fire would ignite in her belly. A raw, burning rage. He would not have the satisfaction of her quiet death. She would not become a forgotten postscript to his treachery. If she was to die here, it would be fighting, snarling, clinging to life with broken fingernails. With Herculean effort, she dragged herself out of the wagon. The pain was blinding, causing sweat to bead on her forehead, despite the freezing air. Using a sturdy branch as a crutch, she surveyed her domain. A ravine of shattered rock and snow, a broken wagon, and a silence that pressed in from all sides. It was on the evening of the third day that she saw him. The sun had set, and the world was bathed in the pale ethereal light of a rising moon. He was standing on a rocky outcrop not 30 yards away, a silhouette against the snow. He was enormous, larger than any dog she had ever seen, with a thick coat of fur the color of bone. His head was raised, and as she watched, he let out that same haunting, lonely howl she had heard on the first morning. It was not a cry of aggression, but of profound, aching solitude. A lone wolf. Fear, primal and immediate, seized her. She scrambled back towards the wagon, her hand fumbling for the cold, heavy weight of the pistol Elias had left her. She was a city girl. Her only knowledge of wolves came from fireside stories, where they were the villains, the shadowy beasts that preyed on the weak and lost. She watched him for what felt like hours. He did not move closer. He simply stood there, a silent, watchful sentinel. His presence was unnerving, yet not entirely threatening. There was a stillness about him, a regal indifference that was somehow less terrifying than the slinking, hungry creature of her imagination. Exhaustion eventually won out over fear, and she retreated into the wagon, the loaded pistol clutched in her hand, and fell into a fitful, pain-ridden sleep. When she awoke at dawn, stiff and shivering, she found it. Lying in the snow a few yards from the wagon was the carcass of a rabbit. It was freshly killed, its body still steaming faintly in the frigid air. Her first thought was that it was a trap, a lure. The wolf was trying to draw her out, but as the morning wore on and the wolf made no other appearance, a different, more radical thought began to take root. Could it be a gift? The idea was absurd, a fantasy born of desperation. But the gnawing hunger in her stomach was not a fantasy. After hours of watching and waiting, her caution finally lost its battle with her need. With her crutch and the pistol, she hobbled out to the rabbit. She looked around, scanning the ridges and the trees. Nothing. The wilderness was still and silent. With trembling hands, she took the offering. That night, for the first time in days, she had a proper meal. The small fire she managed to build was a beacon of defiance in the vast darkness, and the taste of the roasted meat was the most exquisite thing she had ever known. It was the taste of survival. This became their strange, unspoken ritual. Every morning, or sometimes in the deep of the night, she would find a new offering. Another rabbit, a ptarmigan, once a large snowshoe hare. And in return she began to leave a portion of her own meager rations, a piece of hardtack, a small strip of dried meat, on the same rock where he had first appeared. She never saw him take it, but by morning it was always gone. She started calling him Ghost. It suited him. He was a phantom, a whisper in the wilderness. She would catch glimpses of him at the edge of the tree line, or silhouetted on a distant ridge, always watching, always keeping his distance. He was her guardian, her provider, a constant presence in a world that had abandoned her. The fear she initially felt had transformed into a profound, almost mystical sense of connection. He was alone, an outcast, just as she was. They were two solitary creatures, clinging to existence in an unforgiving world. Their bond was forged in the crucible of a shared enemy, the brutal indifference of the wild. But it was solidified by an act of unexpected violence. A week into her ordeal, Mabel was gathering firewood near a dense thicket of pines when the sound of a low growl froze her in her tracks. It was not the sound of Ghost. This was a guttural, menacing rumble that vibrated through the snow at her feet. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Not 20 feet away, a cougar was crouched low to the ground, its long tail twitching. Its yellow eyes were fixed on her, its muscles coiled like a spring. It was lean and hungry, and in its gaze, Mabel saw her own imminent, violent death. She fumbled for the pistol tucked in her waistband, but her hands were clumsy with cold and terror. The cat let out a snarl, revealing a terrifying array of sharp white teeth. Before she could even raise the gun, a blur of white shot out from the trees. Ghost. He slammed into the cougar with the force of a freight train, a whirlwind of white fur and furious snarls. The two predators tumbled in the snow, a maelstrom of tooth and claw. The cougar was larger, more powerful, but Ghost was possessed by a righteous fury. He was faster, more agile, his attacks precise and relentless. The air was filled with the terrifying sounds of their battle, the shrieks of the cat, the deep-throated growls of the wolf. Mabel could only watch, paralyzed with a mixture of terror and awe. This was the raw, untamed violence of nature, a world away from the polite cruelties of St. Louis society. This was real. The fight was brutal and short. Ghost managed to lock his jaws onto the cougar's neck, shaking his head with a primal ferocity. The larger cat, choking and bleeding, finally broke free and fled, disappearing back into the forest, leaving a trail of red against the pristine white. Ghost stood, panting, his white coat stained with his own blood. A deep gash ran along his flank, and his shoulder was bleeding freely. He looked at Mabel, his yellow eyes burning with a wild intelligence. Then he stumbled and lay down in the snow, his breathing ragged. The barrier of fear between them was shattered. He had saved her life. He had fought for her. Without a second thought, Mabel ripped a long strip from the hem of her petticoat. She approached him slowly, cautiously. He watched her, a low rumble in his chest, but he did not move. "Easy now, Ghost," she murmured, her voice soft and soothing. "Easy, boy. You saved me. Let me help you." She knelt beside him, her hands trembling. She gently cleaned the wound on his flank with snow, her touch as light as she could make it. He flinched, but allowed her to tend to him. She then wrapped the makeshift bandage around his torso, tying it as securely as she could. He watched her the entire time, his gaze unwavering. When she was done, she sat back on her heels. He rested his great head on his paws and looked at her. In that moment, the space between human and beast, between the civilized and the wild, collapsed. They were no longer just two outcasts. They were a pack of two. The next morning, Ghost was on his feet, though he favored his injured leg. He looked at her, then turned and took a few steps, looking back over his shoulder. The message was clear. It was time to leave. Staying in the ravine was a slow death sentence. Her food was nearly gone, and winter was tightening its grip. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that to stay was to die. But to leave with her shattered ankle was to embrace a different, more immediate kind of death. Ghost, however, seemed to have a plan. He nudged her hand with his nose, then turned and began to walk slowly and deliberately away from the ravine and towards the dense, unknown forest to the north. He would walk a few paces, then stop and wait for her, his yellow eyes patient and encouraging. Mabel looked back at the wrecked wagon, the symbol of her broken past. Then she looked at the wolf, the unlikely guardian who had become her only hope. With her branch for a crutch, a heart full of a strange new courage, and her wolf leading the way. Mabel Blackwood took her first painful step out of her grave and into the vast frozen wasteland. The journey would be an agony, but it was a journey toward something. And for the first time since Silas's betrayal, she was not just surviving. She was fighting her way back to the world of the living. The world became a relentless cycle of pain, cold and motion. Each step on her splintered ankle was a fresh torment, a fiery protest that shot up her entire leg. Mabel learned to move in a lurching, three-legged rhythm, her makeshift crutch sinking into the snow, her arms aching from the strain. The landscape was a monotonous, beautiful, and deadly expanse of white. Towering pines, heavy with snow, frozen creeks that glittered like veins of glass, and the oppressive, overwhelming silence. If not for Ghost, she would have been dead in a day. The wolf was a master of this frozen domain. He seemed to possess an innate map, a knowledge of the land that defied explanation. He guided her away from deep snowdrifts, where she would have floundered and sunk, leading her along ridges where the wind had scoured the snow down to a manageable depth. He found sheltered rock formations where they could huddle for the night, protected from the worst of the wind. He continued to hunt, bringing her small game that they would share two predators huddled around a meager, sputtering fire. Her former life fell away like dead skin. The memory of silk dresses and polite society teas was an absurdity in this new reality. Her hands, once soft and manicured, were now raw, chapped, and calloused. Her face was weathered by the wind and sun. The St. Louis debutante was a ghost. In her place was a creature of the mountains, as lean and hungry as the wolf who walked beside her. Days blurred into a week. She lost track of time, measuring her existence not by a calendar, but by sunrises and the gnawing ache in her belly. There were moments of utter despair, times when she would collapse into the snow, weeping from pain and exhaustion, ready to give up. In these moments, Ghost would come to her. He would not offer a human comfort, but would nudge her with his wet nose or lick the frozen tears from her cheek, a low whine rumbling in his chest. His presence was a silent, insistent demand. Get up. Keep moving. And she would. Fueled by his persistence and her own simmering rage at Silas, she would push herself to her feet and take another step and then another. He was leading her somewhere. She felt it. His path was not random. There was a purpose to his direction, a steady northward trajectory. Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, began to bloom in the barren landscape of her heart. She saw the first sign of human life late one afternoon, a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from a chimney she could not yet see, staining the pale blue sky. Mabel stopped, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she was terrified. The only human contact she'd had in weeks was the memory of betrayal and abandonment. Men were a danger, but Ghost was undeterred. He glanced at her, then continued forward with a new sense of urgency. Her curiosity and desperation overruled her fear. She followed. An hour later, they crested a low hill, and she saw it. Nestled in a small, sheltered valley, almost swallowed by the pines, was a log cabin. It was small and sturdy, with a heart chimney that breathed a steady plume of grey smoke into the cold air. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. As they drew closer, the wolf slowed his body, tensing. He melted back into the shadows of the trees, leaving her to approach alone. It was his signal. This was her destination. A man was outside his back to her. He was splitting wood with a grim efficiency, the rhythmic thwack of his axe, the only sound in the valley. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskins and a heavy wool coat. A long rifle leaned against the cabin wall within easy reach. Mabel's heart hammered. She was a wreck, a wild-looking woman in torn, dirty clothes with a splintered leg and a piece of wood for a crutch. What would he think? Would he help her? Or would he see her as a threat, a vagrant to be driven away? She took a deep breath, the icy air searing her lungs, and called out, "Hello. Hello, the cabin." The man froze. He did not turn immediately. His whole body went still, like a stag sensing a predator. Then slowly he lowered his axe and turned to face her. His face was a mask of grizzled hardship. A thick, unkempt beard shot through with grey covered the lower half. His eyes, under the brim of a worn fur hat, were the colour of slate, and they held a deep, profound weariness, a distrust that seemed to have been carved there by years of sorrow. This was not a man who welcomed visitors. He was Ezekiel Zeke Hart. Once a U.S. Marshal, a man who had believed in law and justice. Now he was a recluse, a ghost in his own life, haunted by a past he could not outrun. "Keep your distance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. "Please," Mabel began, her voice cracking. "I need help. I've been in an accident. My leg—" Zeke's eyes flickered down to her splintered ankle, then back to her face. He saw the desperation there, but his expression remained hard, unforgiving. "This ain't a charity house. The world's full of accidents. Not my concern." He turned back to his woodpile, dismissing her completely. The coldness of his rejection was more chilling than the mountain air. Tears of frustration and despair welled in her eyes. She had come so far, endured so much, only to be turned away at the first sign of sanctuary. "Please, She tried again, her voice breaking. "I have nowhere else to go. I'll die out here." "Then die," he said without looking at her. "We all do. Some just get there sooner." His cruelty was so absolute, it stunned her into silence. She had faced the indifference of nature, but the deliberate, calculated indifference of a fellow human was a different kind of wound. She stood there for a long moment, swaying on her crutch, the last vestiges of her hope draining away. She was about to turn to limp back into the wilderness and accept her fate when a movement at the edge of the trees caught Ezekiel's eye. Ghost stepped silently out of the shadows. He didn't growl or show any aggression. He simply stood there, his injured flank, with its makeshift bandage clearly visible, his yellow eyes fixed on Zeke. Ezekiel's heart froze again, his hand resting on the handle of his axe. He was a man of the mountains. He knew wolves. He knew they were creatures of pack and instinct, and they did not, as a rule, associate with humans. And this wolf, this massive white wolf, standing calmly beside this desperate woman, was something outside of his experience. It was unnatural. He looked from the wolf to the woman, then back to the wolf. He saw the crude bandage on its side. He saw the way the animal stood near her, not as a threat, but as a guardian. A flicker of something not kindness, but a deep, grudging curiosity broke through his hardened exterior. Mabel, seeing her chance, pressed on. "He's with me. He's been helping me." Zeke's gaze was locked on the wolf. He had seen much in his life, the worst of outlaws, the bloodiest of feuds. But this quiet tableau was one of the strangest sights he had ever witnessed. It defied the rules of the world as he knew it, and Ezekiel Hart, for all his desire to be left alone, had always been a man intrigued by things that broke the rules. He looked back at Mabel. He saw past the dirt and the torn clothes. He saw the unyielding steel in her eyes, the same fierce will to survive that he recognized in the wolf, and perhaps in the deepest, most buried part of his soul, he saw a glimmer of another woman, another time, a woman whose life he had failed to save. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he finally relented. He jerked his head towards the cabin. "Get inside," he grumbled, "before you freeze to death on my doorstep, and I have to go to the trouble of burying you." The words were rough, but they were the most beautiful words Mabel had ever heard. Weak with relief, her legs gave out from under her. She crumpled into the ground in a heap. Ezekiel muttered a curse under his breath. For the first time in 5 years, he crossed the invisible line he had drawn around his heart and his home. He strode over to the fallen woman, bent down, and with a grunt of effort, lifted her into his arms. As he carried her towards the warmth and safety of his cabin, he glanced back at the edge of the forest. The white wolf was still there, a silent phantom against the snow, watching them with knowing golden eyes, before turning and melting back into the trees. Ezekiel Hart had just let the world back into his life, and he had a sinking feeling it was going to bring a hell of a lot of trouble with it. The cabin's interior was as sparse and weathered as the man himself. A hearth fireplace, a simple table and a bed in the corner, a space built for pure survival, not comfort. Ezekiel Hart laid her gently on a rough-spun blanket near the fire. His touch surprisingly careful for such a gruff man. He worked in grim silence, his lips tightening as he cut away her crude splint to reveal the swollen, discolored flesh of her ankle. "Broken clean through," he muttered. "You're lucky you didn't lose the foot." He set the bone with a practiced skill that forced a scream from Mabel's throat, then fashioned a new splint from smooth pine and clean cloth. For 2 days she drifted in a feverish haze, conscious only of the fire's warmth and the shadowy presence of the man who moved like a restless bear within the cabin's walls. Each morning he would find a fresh rabbit or a brace of birds on the porch left by Ghost. Zeke would retrieve the offerings with a shake of his head, a silent, grudging respect for the wolf that patrolled the edges of his solitude. When the fever broke, Mabel awoke to a world of quiet routine. A fragile truce existed between them, mediated by the wolf. As her strength returned, she began to mend the fabric of the cabin as much as her own body. She could not walk, but she could mend his torn clothes, organize his cluttered shelves, and turn the game Ghost provided into savory stews. Slowly, the cabin's oppressive loneliness began to recede, replaced by the scent of baking bread and the soft sounds of a shared existence. For the first time in 5 years, Ezekiel Hart's home did not feel empty, a fact that unsettled him deeply. They began to talk their conversations, circling the dangerous truths of their pasts. She learned he had been in the mountains for 5 years, a recluse by choice. He in turn saw the resilient steel beneath her refined St. Louis exterior. He began to see her not as an intrusion, but as a person, a far more dangerous thing. The dam of their shared silence finally broke one evening as a blizzard raged outside, a furious echo of the storm that had begun her nightmare. Zeke sat staring into the fire, a whiskey cup in his hand, his face etched with a deeper sorrow than usual. "You never said how you came to be in that ravine," he said, his voice a low rumble. Mabel hesitated. To speak her husband's name felt like giving power to a demon. But she owed this man the truth. She recounted the entire story, the journey west, the promises, the chilling, calculated betrayal, and the final lonely abandonment. As she spoke, she relived the agony of it, but her voice remained steady, hardened by the ordeal. Zeke listened without interruption, his knuckles white around his cup. When she finished, his eyes blazed with a cold fire. She didn't understand. "This man," he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated with suppressed violence. "This husband of yours. What was his name? Why does it matter? What?" He repeated, his voice harder, an undeniable command. "Was his name?" Mabel took a breath, the air in the cabin suddenly thick and heavy. "Blackwood. Silas Blackwood." The name landed with the force of a physical blow. Ezekiel went utterly still, the color draining from his face. The whiskey cup slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor, its contents spreading like a dark stain. He looked at her, his weary grief ripped away to reveal a raw, naked agony, so profound it stole her breath. "Silas Blackwood." He whispered the name, a vile curse on his lips. "You're sure?" "Of course I'm sure," she said, alarmed by his violent reaction. He lurched to his feet and strode to a dusty wooden chest in the corner, one she had never seen him open. Fumbling with the latch, he threw it open and pulled out a yellowed, folded wanted poster. He thrust it into her hands. It was for the arrest of the Red Creek Gang, wanted for robbery and murder. There were sketches of 5 men, and their younger and without a beard but unmistakable was her husband, underneath the name Silas Sill Blackwood, known associate. 5 years ago. Ezekiel began, his voice choked and hollowed out by memory. "I was a U.S. Marshal. I was closing in on the Red Creek Gang." He stopped, his gaze fixed on a point 5 years in the past. "I made a mistake. I went after them alone. They wanted to make an example of me. So they rode to my home first." His voice broke, and tears tracked through the grime on his cheeks. "My wife Anna, my daughter little Cora." He looked at Mabel, his eyes mirroring the horror she felt. They set fire to the cabin, with them inside. Blackwood. He was one of them. I saw him. I saw him riding away from the flames, laughing. The world tilted. The man who had left her to die was not just a greedy thief. He was a monster whose evil had a history written in blood and fire. Fate, in its cruel and incomprehensible wisdom, had delivered Silas Blackwood's latest victim to the doorstep of the one man in the world who had a deeper, more terrible reason to see him burn. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a deadlier storm had just broken. The separate griefs of Mabel and Ezekiel had converged, braided together by the echo of a single name. Their quest was no longer about survival or justice. It was now a reckoning. The journey south was a pilgrimage of grim purpose. The fragile peace of the cabin was replaced by a tense, focused energy as Ezekiel Hart, the resurrected lawman, honed Mabel into a weapon. He taught her the cold calculus of a gunfight, and the heavy Colt she practiced with became a tangible extension of her will. "You don't aim with your hand," he'd instructed, his voice a low gravel. "You aim with your soul." Her pain and rage became her sharpest sights. They traveled with a singular focus, leaving the high peaks for the dusty, sage-brushed hills. Ghost shadowed their passage, a silent partner to their quest. They would catch glimpses of white on a distant mesa, or wake to find a fresh kill near their camp, a wild affirmation of their shared mission. Redemption was a sprawling, chaotic town built on the back of a silver strike, a place where sin was currency and desperation was the air you breathed. At its heart, presiding over it all like a king on a throne of lies, was Silas Blackwood. He was no longer a desperate prospector, but Mr. Blackwood, the owner of the town's grandest saloon, the Gilded Cage, and a man of immense influence. He had laundered Mabel's dowry into a fortress of respectability. They saw him on their first day, dressed in a tailored suit, Maeve draped on his arm in silken jewels. They were laughing, prosperous, and untouchable. The sight of them flaunting the life he had stolen from her poured gasoline on the fire of Mabel's hatred. Zeke's plan was not simply to kill Silas, but to dismantle him piece by piece. They took a room in a dilapidated boarding house and began to weave their web. Zeke, appearing as just another grizzled prospector, haunted the backroom card games, spreading whispers of the old Red Creek gang, and a partner who had betrayed them running off with a stolen payroll. He never spoke Silas's name, but he seeded the town's paranoia with doubt. Mabel, meanwhile, played a different role. She became Mrs. Smith, a quiet, sorrowful widow, whose gentle demeanor earned her the town's sympathy. She became an invisible fixture, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the storm they were about to unleash. The reckoning was set for 2 weeks later, during a high-stakes poker game Zeke had maneuvered his way into. It was held in a private room in the Gilded Cage, drawing in Redemption's most powerful figures, including the aging but honorable Sheriff Thompson. And of course, Silas Blackwood himself, smug and confident in the heart of his empire. When the game was in full swing and the whiskey was flowing, Mabel pushed through the saloon's swinging doors. A hush fell over the raucous room as she moved through the crowd, a spectre of mourning in a den of revelry. Ignoring the stairs, she walked directly to the back room and opened the door. Every eye turned. Zeke gave no sign of recognition. Silas stared his glass halfway to his lips, his face contorting from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a stark, bone-white terror. He was looking at a ghost. "Mabel," He whispered the name, a strangled horror. "Hello, husband," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room, as clear and cold as mountain ice. Silas, ever the performer, recovered in an instant. He shot to his feet, his face a perfect mask of astonished joy. "Mabel, my God, you're alive." He rushed toward her, arms open. "I thought I'd lost you." She stepped back, her gaze unwavering. "You thought you'd left me?" She corrected, her voice sharp with accusation. "You left me to die in a ravine." Silas let out a desperate, theatrical laugh and turned to the other men. "Gentlemen, my apologies. This is my poor wife. The accident, the ordeal has unhinged her." He tapped his temple with a sad, knowing look. "She has delusions. I have been searching for her for months." His performance was masterful, and the other players exchanged pitying looks. Sheriff Thompson rose, his expression sympathetic. "Ma'am, perhaps you should come with me. We can get you some help." "Ask him," Mabel demanded, her voice ringing with righteous fury. "Ask him where he got the money for this saloon. Ask him about the Red Creek gang." Silas flinched. At the same moment, Zeke spoke from across the table, his voice a low growl. "That's a good question, Blackwood. I've heard whispers about that old gang." "I don't know what you're talking about, old man," Silas spat. "Don't you?" Ezekiel rose slowly, his presence filling the room. He tossed the old creased wanted poster onto the green felt table. The drawing was younger, beardless, but the eyes were unmistakable. "Because I remember you quite clearly." He pushed back his hat. Sheriff Thompson stared, his jaw slackening in disbelief. "Marshal Hart, Ezekiel Hart. We all thought you were dead." "I have been," Ezekiel said, his cold eyes locked on Silas. "And I'm here to collect a debt for my wife Anna, for my daughter Cora." The name of his victims hung in the air, sealing Silas's doom. His world shattered. In a final desperate act of cowardice, he lunged for Maeve, who had come to the door to investigate the commotion. He yanked her in front of him, a human shield, and pressed the barrel of a derringer to her head. "Nobody move!" he shrieked, his eyes wild with panic. Maeve's face was a mask of shocked betrayal. She now saw the pathetic snake for what he truly was. The standoff was broken by a sound no one expected, a crash of glass from the main saloon, followed by a terrifying, inhuman snarl. Chaos erupted. Ghost, a blur of white fury, had leaped through the front window and was attacking one of Silas's men, who had drawn on the sheriff. The diversion was all Ezekiel needed. As every head turned, his Colt was already in his hand. He didn't risk a shot at Silas. He fired at the massive crystal chandelier overhead. The fixture exploded in a shower of glass, crashing down and cutting off Silas's escape. In that instant of chaos, Maeve drove her elbow into Silas's ribs and dropped to the floor. Exposed and alone, Silas fired his derringer wildly. Zeke's return shots were precise and cruel. The first shattered Silas's gun hand. The second took him in the knee, dropping him to the floor in a screaming, pathetic heap. It was over. Sheriff Thompson and his men swarmed in, dragging the whimpering king of redemption away. Amid the wreckage, Mabel stood trembling, her gaze meeting Zeke's across the room. In the doorway, Ghost stood panting. His duty done. The unlikely pack had brought its reckoning and justice to redemption. Justice in redemption was swift. With Silas Blackwood's treachery laid bare by Maeve's testimony, and a federal warrant, his empire crumbled. His fate was the gallows, and Mabel's stolen fortune was returned in full. The fire of vengeance had cooled, leaving a quiet, uncertain void. The town offered Ezekiel a deputy's badge, and St. Louis beckoned to Mabel with the promise of her former life. But both paths felt like trails leading into the past. Standing at the edge of town one evening, they watched the sun set over the distant mountains. "Being a lawman, that's not me anymore," Zeke said, his voice quiet but certain. "My place is up there." He nodded toward the peaks. Mabel looked at the man who understood her scars, knowing her own truth with absolute clarity. "The woman who belonged in St. Louis died in that ravine," she said softly. "My place is no longer there either." A silent understanding passed between them, a shared recognition that their futures lay not in reclaiming what was lost, but in building something new. A rare smile touched Ezekiel's eyes. "The cabin is small, not much for a woman of your means." "It's a foundation," she answered, her own smile answering his. "But it could certainly use another room, and perhaps a garden come spring." They rode north the next day, away from the dust and towards the clean, sharp air of the high country. As they neared the foothills, Mabel saw him one last time, a lone white figure on a distant ridge. Ghost stood for a long moment, a silent, wild salute, before turning and melting back into his wilderness. Arriving at the Hart cabin was a true homecoming. It was no longer a hermit's refuge or a desperate sanctuary, but a promise. The fire Zeke built in the hearth cast a warm, dancing light on their faces, illuminating not the ghosts of their pasts, but the quiet hope for their future. The frozen wasteland had been meant as Mabel's grave. Instead, it had become the crucible where two broken souls had been forged into one, ready to build a new life on the solid rock of a hard-won love. In the end, the frozen wasteland that was designed as Mabel's tomb became her crucible. The ice did not claim her, it forged her. The betrayal that sought to break her instead revealed a strength she never knew she possessed. She, along with Ezekiel Hart, a man pulled back from the brink of his own despair, found that their deepest wounds were not a barrier, but a bridge to a new life. And on the ridge, a silent guardian, the wolf named Ghost, stands as a testament to the wild, untamable spirit that resides in them all. A reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, loyalty can be found, and new beginnings can take root in the most unforgiving soil. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Wild West. If you were captivated by Mabel's story of survival and revenge, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with fellow lovers of epic drama, and subscribing to our channel for more tales of history, hardship, and the untamable human spirit. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an adventure. Until next time, stay brave and watch your back trail.